It is the Marin Bible Podcast, and this is Pastor Jim Barnes coming to you on the topic of gospel-shaped parenting. I am so glad you've joined us today, and I keep saying plural words like us and we. I don't know why pastors do that, but we do it quite regularly. Thanks for joining me today. And I hope you've had a fabulous week. I don't know where you're at right now. Maybe you're driving. Hopefully you're not watching this on YouTube and driving. Maybe you're sitting at home. Maybe you are crying into a bowl of ice cream after a hard day of parenting. Whatever situation you're in, I'm glad that you have joined me. And if you remember, we are specifically trying to give you encouraging words to weary parents. If you are a parent who has everything under control, you're not struggling in the least, you are playing games every day with your children after work and laughing and giggling all the time, and you have an unending source of energy in your life, and really it's like heaven on earth in your home, then this is probably not the podcast for you, because this is a podcast for people like me who are in the thick of parenting. Sometimes I have people say, do you have any tips for parenting? And of course, I can think of practical wisdom that sometimes come from it. But honestly, there are days, this is my opinion, and it's transparent opinion, there are days you're just trying to survive. You realize I am not doing well as a parent, and I just need to get through this day. And there are going to be times, because we're humans, that we just simply don't know the answers to the challenges that are facing us in parenting. And I'm one of those people. As I said before, we have a 16-year-old, that's our oldest. He'll be 17 in May, going into his senior year next year. And so he'll be graduating from college. And then the very next year, the next school year, I have my youngest starting kindergarten. So that's a big age range. I don't know what I'm doing sometimes, especially in the teen years. I don't know, because this is my first time having teenagers. So I'm not coming to you from a place of superiority. I'm not coming to you from a place of let me teach you my grand wisdom that I've learned. But I will tell you one thing that I have learned, and that is that the more I understand the gospel and let its roots sink deep inside of me, the better parent I am. On average, that's just the way it works. And typically when I'm having a really rough day, it's probably because I have lost the real moorings, the foundation under my feet of the gospel. And so we sort of walk through the gospel, and each time we hear a different sort of statement, a proclamation coming out of the gospel that helps us become better parents. Last week, the statement was, I'm not in control. Remember, the gospel starts in Genesis chapter 1. That's where the gospel really starts, because the good news is it is God who is our creator. We did not come from nothing. There was God. And because he created all things, he is the one in charge. So we view our children as the possession of God. And we are simply stewards of what God has given to us. But ultimately, we're not the one in charge, and we can't control everything. And that prevents us from being that authoritarian, angry parent all the time. Today, we come to the second statement that comes out of the gospel message, and that is, not only are we not in control, but we can also say to ourselves, I am not perfect. I am not perfect. Now, these are statements I hope that you'll say every morning as you wake up and look in the mirror. They're not statements built on self-affirmations or self-confidence. These are statements that come directly out of a gospel message from God. So these are things you should be able to say to yourself and preach to yourself every day. And I know the first two feel a little negative, but they're very important to help you. And this statement that says, I am not perfect, is going to help you from being an arrogant parent. So last week we talked about authoritarian parents, how they're always sort of mean and angry, in control, and wanting to make sure they're in control, but they're actually scared. Well, I also know it's easy to be an arrogant parent, to look down on your children as if you would never do the things that they do. Now, I will be honest with you, there are times that I'm frightened by what I see in my children because they're mere reflections of what I am. Have you ever noticed that your kids, you're starting to pick up on the fact that your kids are like you in some ways? Now, some things are just biological. Some things are biological. My son Carter, my oldest, he's the one that'll be 17 soon. He's just naturally thin. He's tall and he's thin. And he is doing his best right now to eat protein and gain weight and all of that. But biologically, he just inherited really my genetics, because my dad's side of the family were all sort of thin people. We were not weightlifters and football players. So that's biological. Some things are neurological, meaning the way that people think. My daughter Campbell, the next down, she's 15, she loves to plan things out. So she likes to write lists down, and she likes to plan her whole high school career out and what she wants to be in college. And then if she has to take a trip somewhere, she writes down a packing list that is long and weeks in advance. That all comes from my wife. I don't do those kind of things. I don't. And my son, Carter, never would do anything like that. So she likes to have lists, and that's more of a mental thing. She wants that control of knowing I'm prepared. And then some things are just environmental. The culture of the home which you grow up in. Like my boys and I, we love basketball. But my boys love basketball primarily because they see me watching it all the time. And we love to play basketball and shoot around and play games with basketball. And so growing up in a home, typically, you're probably going to have a better chance of liking basketball because your dad did. And my dad loved sports and loved watching basketball. But there are also times that I see my kids and I realize, oh no, that sort of tendency, that sin, that error, mistake that I see in their life, that is something I myself struggle with, or I have struggled with and still struggle with, even to this day. And so really the gospel helps us say, I also am not perfect. And the gospel means that not only did God create the world in Genesis chapter 1, but the humans that he created rebelled in Genesis chapter 3. And so when Adam reached out and took the fruit from Eve and rebelled, he, as the head of the human race, therefore plunged everyone into a sinful state in which we are born by default rebels on self-destruct mode. The only thing that Adam and Eve had to do in the garden was not eat the fruit. And yet, because if you eat the fruit, you're going to die. And what do? Well, they eat the fruit. And still to this day, we find ourselves, you and I, but also our children, we have to stop them from doing things that would eventually harm themselves. And that is what sin is at its root. And God in his graciousness provides a sacrifice for Adam and Eve, sends them out of the garden, and then protects them from ever getting back in the garden by putting guardian angels there at the front of the garden as well. And so from that time forth, humans would be rebels. Now, when we apply that to our parenting, that means sinners, like you and me, we give birth to sinners, like our children. Now, I could probably get a lot more amens and agreement when I'm talking about that last part of the phrase, we beget sinners, because you probably see your children making decisions all the time that are sinful. But I want instead to emphasize the first part of that statement, which is your little sinner got its sin from you. It is passed down through the human race. And so there are times you're going to have to realize, wow, I too need to approach my kids' sin with an amount of humility that says, I too also rebel and find myself going my own way. This happened a couple of years ago. I remember walking into my boys' room and they needed help. One of their drawers was not working correctly. And we did have an old dresser that we'd had for a while, and the bottom drawer was struggling. But when I pulled out the dresser drawer to look at it, the clothes inside of it had no order, there was stuff, it looked like a homeless person had just thrown all their stuff in that bottom drawer. And I gave my kids my boys, a lecture about keeping their drawers straight. There's no reason you shouldn't have your drawers folded and in the right places so that it will shut correctly. This is ridiculous. I shouldn't have to come in here and fix a drawer because you can't just simply fold a shirt and put it in your drawer. I said that, and within 15 minutes, I went into my room to get something out of my drawer to change. And when I opened my drawer up, it hit me suddenly. There was my drawer with clothes everywhere. the drawer that I keep all my t-shirts in that I want to wear from time to time to go running or to wear outside, it was a disaster. And I realized, oh, here I am pointing the finger at them. And now I have to look and go, maybe I'm part of this problem too. So this part of the gospel message is important because it prevents us from being arrogant or self-righteous parents. Now, what is a self-righteous parent? What does this look like? These are parents who approach their child's behavior as if they themselves were not sinners. So here's some common characteristics of that kind of person or that kind of parent. Self-righteous parents are harsh punishers. They punish very harshly. No measurement to their punishment. It's just all out. They are unsympathetic. They don't care about a person suffering from their consequences or their child suffering from their consequences. Oftentimes, forgiveness is withheld, even when asked. When someone says, I'm sorry, there's not a clear forgiveness, but instead, oftentimes, self-righteous parents hold on to grudges and keep them to themselves. Yes, even against their children. They often bring up past failures. Oh, I'm glad you're doing that now, but do you remember last time? I'm glad you're not doing what you did last time when I asked you to do that. Instead of praising a child for now making the right decision, they compare it with the bad decision that was made in the past. And then oftentimes they talk down to their kids with very little grace, because it comes from this place of arrogance. I don't do those kind of things. You do those kind of things. But when you are being aware of the fact that you also are a son or daughter of Adam, then that prevents us from being self-righteous. And parents that are coming from a place of humility and understanding that they too are sinners, they punish their children with empathy. Now, that means punishment, by the way, has to be done. You have to offer consequences to your children. That's absolutely essential. God punishes his children. And that's a means of teaching consequences, humility, authority. That is what God intends. But we can actually punish our children with some empathy involved as well. We offer full and complete forgiveness whenever that is asked for. Whenever it's asked for, I'm sorry. Absolutely 100% you're forgiven. That's okay. And then we refuse to pull up old sins and recount them again or use them as weapons against our children. Well, I hope this time you won't do that again. Instead, that's in the past. I'm moving forward. And then we talk to our kids as fellow sinners who are also in need of a savior. I also need Jesus. And this is a great way to discipline your children in a way that is gospel-centered, and that is to say, yes, that decision you made was a decision because you wanted what you want. I do the same thing, and that's why Jesus has offered us forgiveness. And that allows us to be parents who are not self-righteous and arrogant parents. There's a great passage of scripture that I think speaks to this. It's in Matthew chapter 18. I won't read it all, but you can go back and read it if you want to. It's verses 23 and following. Matthew chapter 18, there is a landowner, a king, a great ruler who is bringing in all those that owe him money. And there's one of his servants that owes him millions of dollars. And he says, you need to pay. I've been giving you a chance to pay and you haven't paid. And he says, I don't have the money. And he says, then you are going to go and be a slave. I'm going to throw you into prison. And you, your wife, your children, they all have to be slaves now and work off this debt. And the man begs the king, please be patient with me and I will pay it all back. Now, truth be told, he's not going to pay it all back, but the man says, okay, I will forgive you. I will forgive that entire debt. You do not owe anything. Isn't that amazing? So the man goes out and he goes to the people who owe him money, specifically one man that owes him money, and he grabs him by the collar, by the throat, and says, you better pay me back my money. Now, there's another separate part of this illustration that is, why does this man try to pay back something that he already doesn't owe anymore? But regardless of the fact, he, instead of extending grace, he grabs this man by the collar and says, you need to pay me back my money. And he only owed him $100. And the guy says, I can't. And he says, then you're going to go to prison. Well, some of the fellow servants saw this happening and they went and told the king, the one in charge. And he said, this guy's threatening these people with death if they don't pay him back. And the king brings him in and says, what in the world are you doing? I forgave you this much money, $1 million, and you're not extending that same forgiveness to these people that owe you money? Absolutely not. That's absolutely ridiculous. And Jesus is making the point that if we truly have been forgiven, by Jesus and extended this grace to us, then why would we not extend that same grace to someone else? Now, remember, what I mean by this is that we are supposed to be able to grant grace to our children. God grants grace to us every day. Does he still discipline us? Absolutely, 100%. He does give discipline because he's a good father, but he will grant discipline with grace in the midst of it as well. So let's think about this just for a second. Let's put this into real practice. Here is Julie. She's a parent, a mom. She catches her child watching YouTube. I know kids, all the kids watch YouTube nowadays. Nobody's watching actual TV. So she catches her child watching YouTube, and she has told her child she's not supposed to be watching anything. And so she just loses it. She screams at her child. She tells her she'll never be able to trust her again. And she takes the little girl's electronic device away for an entire month and says, you'll never get this back for a whole month. And for the next few weeks, all she does is bring this up again. She reminds her of how untrustworthy she is. And when the little girl says, can I have my tablet back? No, you don't get it for another 3 weeks because do you remember what you did? I trusted you and you don't trust me anymore. That to me is an example of a harsh, self-righteous parenting style. So think about it now. If Julie can capture this idea of the gospel saying, Julie, you too are always needing grace, and you too cross boundaries that God has put in place in your life. So do you have to discipline? Yes, but can we do it from a place of grace? We can do that too. And the answer, I think, the way that Julie could handle this then is Julie still punishes, but does so calmly, without screaming, and with empathy involved. Boy, I'm sorry you chose to disobey me, but I want you to learn that your choices have consequences. So I'm going to keep your tablet. I'm going to keep that now for 3 days. And I want you to really think hard about obeying next time. And when her daughter says, I'm sorry for disobeying, she immediately hugs her and says, I love you. I still love you and I forgive you. And maybe the very next day, when her daughter comes to her and says, can I have my tablet back? Julie doesn't bring up the past and talk about how bad she was yesterday. She just simply says, hey, remember 3 days, and then you get to try again. And that's it. And what happens is there's a level of humility in the way she parents, and there's a level of actual control that happens. She doesn't have to scream to control her child. She can just simply control it by putting consequences in place. So remember, grace and forgiveness, grace and forgiveness. That does not mean zero punishment. God also punishes his children, but he disciplines us for our own good, and he loves us in the middle of our discipline. So sinners, you are giving birth to sinners, and the gospel says to everyone, you are not better than someone else. No one is better than someone else. And what that should do is allow us to then parent from a place of meekness and humility. So today you're going to put this into practice. You really are. I'm guessing that you don't have a perfect child, and I'm guessing that you need to somehow handle an issue that comes up today of disobedience. And that is sin. But when you do it, I want you to ask yourself, is that sin something I can relate to? Because that's very important. And I know you can. So therefore, how do I do it in a way that punishes, but punishes in a measured way, a way in which it fits what's there, it's not too harsh, and I don't need to scream to do so, and I don't need to be mean, and I can offer forgiveness immediately, even while that punishment is in place. I think you can do that. All right. So we've already talked about two different types of parents that we don't want to be, right? We do not want to be authoritarian dictator parents. We don't want to be arrogant parents. And next week, I want us to hear the next statement, which is, I am deeply loved by God. And that will prevent you from being an over-attached parent, meaning a parent who cannot let go of their children, that their children are their life, that they have to have acceptance from their child, and therefore they don't really discipline. They just want their child's acceptance, and it's very hard for them to put their foot down. They don't want to have to confront their child on disobedience. And all of that causes immense problems as the kids get older. So I hope you'll join us next week for our next episode on that. Thanks so much for watching today or listening. Drop us a note in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't done that yet so that you get notifications when we put something new up on YouTube. You can hit the subscribe button. On the podcast thing, you can save that, subscribe to it as well so you get notifications. If you have questions, please feel free to email them to me. I'd be happy to address those on a future episode as well. Until next time, this is Pastor Jim. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Gospel Shaped Parenting.